Hey guys, so today we're going to be starting the second chapter of the second unit, which is all about evolution. Today we're going to go over the different ways that we classify different living organisms. So when we're talking about the classification of living things, what we're really talking about is how we organize all of the different life on Earth into different categories. So we're going to start by looking at the three different domains of life. We're going to talk about what taxonomy is and how we identify what the name of different species are. We're also going to talk about how we determine how related different species are just by looking at their binomial nomenclature. Then we're going to look at all of the different kingdoms, and you do need to know the different characteristics of each kingdom. And then lastly, we're going to describe what phylogeny is. So there are three different domains of life here on Earth. We have the archaea, the bacteria, and the eukarya. The archaea are prokaryotic, which means that they are single-celled and that they don't have a nucleus. So, our DNA is held inside a nucleus, which is surrounded by the nuclear membrane. Archaea do not have that. They also have different RNA, which is kind of like the bacteria version of DNA. They have different RNA and are evolutionarily different than bacteria, which we'll talk about next. They also tend to live in extreme environments like very salty or very acidic water. And they are the oldest of all of the different domains. So archaea have been around here on Earth the longest. Bacteria are also prokaryotic, so they also don't have a nucleus. They can be pathogenic, which means they cause diseases, or they can live symbiotically with animals like the bacteria we have in our digestive system. And then lastly, we have the eukarya, which includes all of the eukaryotes. And eukaryotes are any organisms that actually have a nucleus with like a nuclear membrane around it. These can be both single-celled or multi-celled organisms. They did evolve from prokaryotes many, many moons ago. They undergo cellular division via mitosis, so their cells divide to make more cells. And it includes categories like protists, fungus, plants, and animals. Taxonomy is the science of classifying organisms based on their assumed relationships to one another. It is how we group and identify organisms. The current classification system was created by Carl Linnaeus, who was a Swedish botanist back in the 1700s. He classified organisms based on their physical features and the assumption that organisms that are more closely related have more similar features. We no longer classify organisms based on physical features because we now know that morphology or the physical features can be deceiving. Now we use like genetics instead, but they didn't have genetics back then. The different categories of classification are called taxa. Taxa are the categories that we use to classify animals. A singular of taxa is taxon, and there are 7 main categories that we use, so 7 main taxa. And here we have the list of those 7 from the least specific to the most specific. So you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. You do need to know the order of those from most general to most specific. So you might want to come up with like I forget what it's called, but where you like make up a saying that goes with it. So the one that I was taught when I was young was King Philip called over 50 German spies. Or you could say, whatever you wanted to make up. A couple years ago, my kids had a really funny one, but I can't remember what it was. But anyway, you can make up whatever you want. So this is just some examples. So with humans, we fall into the kingdom of Animalia. So we are technically an animal. Then our phylum is Chordata, which just means we have a spinal cord. Our class is Mammalia because we are mammals. Our order is primates. We are related in that order to all of the different primates, all the different like monkeys and stuff. Our family is the hominid, which just says we have an upright posture, so we walk on 2 feet instead of 4. We have a really large brain, and we use our hands and feet differently. Our genus is Homo, which just means that we have an S-curved spine and we start being recognizable as human rather than a monkey, for instance. And then our species is Homo sapien, which just differentiates us from like the Neanderthal or something like that. Okay, Linnaeus also came up with something called binomial nomenclature, which is the way that we name different organisms. Binomial nomenclature essentially gives most species 2 different names. They're often Latin, or they definitely used to always be Latin. Sometimes they're just made to sound kind of Latin now, but they're not always Latin. And they're often based on characteristics of the organism. It provides a common language for all different scientists around the world to be able to identify a species. If we didn't have binomial nomenclature, the fact that we have different names for species in different languages would make it difficult for, scientists from different parts of the world to communicate about whatever they were studying. But by having this one common name for something that is used by every single scientist around the world, then when we're talking about a species, everyone's on the same page. Everyone knows what we're talking about. The first word of the name is the organism's genus. The second is the organism's species. And we often write it in italics with the first letter of the genus capitalized. So this is kind of a taxonomy comparison of 5 different species here. If I were to give you the scientific name of the brown bear, it would be Ursus arcticus. Okay, so we just take the genus and then the species. Okay, so a dog would be Canis familiaris, for instance. A wolf is Canis lupus. Okay. Okay, scientists currently use 6 different kingdoms in order to kind of start organizing organisms. Again, kingdom is the most general category of taxon. There are 6 different kingdoms. There's the eubacteria, the archaeobacteria, protists, fungi, planta, and animalia. And scientists used to use 5 kingdoms instead. They didn't used to have 2 different categories of bacteria. They just called it Monera instead. Once scientists realized that these 2 types of bacteria are really distinct from one another, they broke that Monera category up into those 2 categories that we used to. So eubacteria includes all organisms from the domain of bacteria. Archaeobacteria includes all of the organisms from the domain Archaea. The main differences between these is that the Archaeobacteria live in really harsh habitats. The eubacteria don't live in that harsh of habitats. And then the eubacteria have cell walls which contain something called peptidoglycan, while Archaeobacteria's cell walls don't contain the peptidoglycan. Protists are usually single-celled, but not always. They are eukaryotes. They do not have a cell wall. They can be autotrophic or heterotrophic, so either producers or consumers. They can produce sexually or asexually, and they tend to live in aquatic or wet ecosystems. Protists include things like algae. Then we have fungi, which are usually multicellular. They do have a cell wall. They are heterotrophic, can produce sexually or asexually, and are usually terrestrial. Those are things like mushrooms and yeast. Then we have the plants, which are multicellular, autotrophic, and have cell walls. Those are things like trees, moss, flowers, that kind of stuff. Animals, also multicellular, but they are heterotrophic and do not have cell walls. They include everything from sponges to fish to reptiles, birds, mammals. Monera, again, that was the kingdom that used to be used to identify all prokaryotes. so the eubacteria and the archaea bacteria. But once scientists realize how different those different groups of bacteria are and how the archaea bacteria evolved so long before the eubacteria, they broke that Monera into the two separate bacteria kingdoms. Okay, phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species. We usually represent it with something called a phylogenetic tree. These trees usually start with the ancestral form of an organism, and then it branches into all of the different descendants of that ancestor. And we use these phylogenetic trees to kind of represent the relationships or the relatedness between different species that have a common ancestor. It used to be determined by morphology, which is the physical features. Now we usually use genetics because it's more accurate. So this is an example of a phylogenetic tree. So at the base here, you would have some sort of ancestor, which was a, vertebrate. And then it's essentially saying, okay, first we have the sharks evolve, then the skeleton evolved, so we got some of our fish, then four limbs evolved and we got our amphibians, then the amniotic egg evolved, so you're no longer laying an egg, but the egg is inside now. And then the primates evolved. From that, or I guess it wasn't just the primates, we had mammals evolve, and then the mammals kind of branched off into the primates and the rodents. You had the shelled eggs evolve, which branched off into both crocodiles and birds. So based on this, you can see, for instance, that crocodiles and birds are fairly closely related because they branched off fairly recently. Rodents and primates, generally more closely related, compared to, say, for instance, a crocodile and an amphibian, which would be much more distant on this tree. Okay, that is it for today's lesson. Make sure that you're really familiar with all of those different characteristics of the kingdoms. And yeah, that's it.